What do we mean by correct English? Oh, that's really cool, Emmy. 4 or 5 deaf girls in your dorm. Awesome. That's really nice. Hey, Tuppy. No worries. No worries at all. Okay. So we've all been drilled into this notion of what's correct or not. But I want us to question, I mean, and there's a certain sense in which a sentence like the one I've got up here is, counts as not correct. Sure. But let's take a closer look. Me and her ain't never been friends, right? In what sense is this incorrect? Like, what's wrong with it? And I know, you don't have to answer this. I know what's going to leap out at everybody. It's not a hard sentence to diagnose, right? Me and her instead of, she and I, right? The double negative, ain't never. The word ain't, right? All of these are non-standard English, right? But before we get judgmental about things, let's think through the kinds of things that we are talking about. Yeah, that ain't never going to happen. Exactly. So first of all, is ain't a word? What do you think? I ask this because I frequently hear this, oh, ain't isn't a word. Yeah, ain't is obviously a word. Yes, it is. You can say it's correct from a linguistics perspective, but it's 100% a word. Yeah, look, a word is a word. It doesn't matter. It might not be a socially acceptable word, but it's a word, right? That's like saying fuck isn't a word, right? Okay, that's interesting. Is it 2 words? So no, it's not 2 words. I'll have to go into... I wasn't planning to do a whole unit in morphology. I was going to skim over that, but I can do it if you want. If you want me to explain word formation, I can do a whole class in morphology. Yes, it is a word. Now, it's a socially disapproved word. The question is why? Why is it a socially disapproved word? It is a variation in pronunciation from the contraction of am not, amment. But amment is really hard to say, right? Notice that no one... Okay, I will do a morphology class. You got word formation, we'll do word formation. Nobody says amment. Right, you can occasionally find that in like early 19th century fiction, but amment just never caught on. Right, ain't did. Right, people decided it was low class, and they began to disapprove of it. Right. One of the things. Let me ask you this: if you consider consider the lengths to which we go to avoid using ain't. We would say, how does a sentence like this sound? Aren't I supposed to go to the store? Does that sound okay to you? Yeah, sounds fine. But think it through. Aren't I? I aren't. I are. She was considered socially inappropriate. Well, you're welcome to make it socially inappropriate, right? So this is the thing. If you really think about it, this sounds totally natural, but in terms of the historical verb endings, we have substituted the are not contraction right? For but nobody ever says I are, right? We don't say I aren't, but in inverted form, aren't I? Right? It's fine. Right? We don't have any problem with it, but we don't have any problem with it. We've substituted that to avoid saying ain't, because there is no socially approved form of the contraction, am not. Right? And this is purely historical prejudice, like people decided they didn't like it. Go for it, Kiwi. Go for it. Now, me and her, instead of she and I, right? We'll talk a lot about case later on. I've got to get, this is, if you're not familiar with the term, case refers to a variation in form of nouns or pronouns, or in some languages, but not English, adjectives. That show their grammatical function, right? And so the traditional rule is simply that you use the same case form within a compound that you do if it's by itself, right? However, why should that be the rule? Right. Another way of looking at it that would be equally logical and actually explains a great deal of what we see for the way people actually speak when they're not being corrected about it, is that the objective case, the me, her case, is actually the default case, right? The one that you use when you don't have a special reason for otherwise. And when you're inside this this compound, like and, it sort of reverts to the default. This would be a perfectly logical, way of describing language, right? It doesn't fit with what has been decided on for the standard form, but it works. Now, ain't never, multiple negation, right? Now, notice I call it multiple negation and not double negation. I was actually talking about this on stream the other week. The reason why I call it multiple negation is that despite the excuse that your teachers probably gave you for why ain't never, or, haven't never, if you want to replace ain't, why that two negatives would be wrong is the idea that two negatives make a positive, which is implicitly using a mathematical metaphor of multiplication, right? Where you reverse the meaning. The problem with that is if that were the right explanation, then three negatives ought to be correct. But you can't say she and I ain't never been no friends, right? That doesn't make it any better. Right. So it's simply having more than one negative in the same scope, right? It's really a question of redundancy. Haven't, not, never. I like that, Kiwi. Very nice. My point here is not to say that me and her ain't never been friends is something that you should be writing, but that the question of whether it is correct or not. I was wondering. I've been thinking about other emojis. Ament. I got to think. How would I do ament? I'm not a big fan of just pure text emojis, but I might make an exception for ament. The point is, like, we do have an idea of standard written English, and there's some validity to it. There are circumstances where we need to pay attention to that. But it is a far more complicated situation. It's far more nuanced than the traditional books or the traditional classrooms are normally willing to recognize. Right? So when we're looking at this thing called error, right, what might we mean by that? Right. So I introduced the ideas of prescriptive and descriptive grammar. Right. So if we are calling something descriptively ungrammatical, in a simplified form, we're basically saying native speakers would probably never say this except by accident. In other words, it exists as not... Oh, thank you, Tuffy. I can go back. Whoop. So what I had in mind here is, and didn't mention, is that there's two things going on. Difference, me and her ain't never been friends. If we simply replace that with I and she have never been friends, that would still not be... does that feel right to you? Would anybody say I and she? Yeah. Yeah. So we would say she and I, right? She and I is strongly preferred. Now, this is actually an area where I've never read a convincing account for what's going on there, but the I clearly has to come second. Now, traditional grammar books explain it as a matter of politeness, that you're supposed to put yourself second. But that's hand-waving bullshit. That doesn't... We're not doing that. If it were just politeness, then I could be rude by saying I and she. Yes, Kiwi, it's dumb, right? You've been saying her and I, yeah. Okay, saying her and I is also very explicable by the sort of rules of language that I was describing. Not the traditional grammar book rules, but the way people are actually behaving unconsciously. So essentially what's going on there, we'll come to this when we talk about pronouns, and we'll talk about case in some detail, but the way you can think about it is that pronouns get assigned a case based on the role that they play in the sentence, right? And one way of thinking about it is that the verb assigns the case to the pronoun that comes right before it. So her and I, but the her, me, the object form is the default form of the pronoun. So what that basically means is, unless the word is right next to the verb, unless it's in an obvious subject position, right, then you don't put, you just, it stays in the default case. So her and I actually it's regularly heard, and it has a very logical linguistic explanation, right? It's not the standard written English form, which would be she and I. The standard English rule is each half of a compound like that should be in the same case that you would use it if you just had one pronoun by itself, right? Her is an object form. Yeah, she is a subject case, or she is the nominative, to use the formal name case. But nominative, subjective case for I. And basically, the subject case is what you would use. Think about it like if you just had that one pronoun as a subject, right? She walks the dog, right? She is a subject case. I walk the dog. He walks the dog. They walk the dog. We walk the dog. Your example, same as single, like she and I ate going to the store because she's going to the store, right? Not her is going to the store. Yes, Emmy, that's exactly, your example is exactly on point. Yeah. Yeah. So whatever the Greek translation, the Greek's nominative, it's the same basic thing. So case and the subject, at least you don't have an ergative language for it. But, hey, Bins! How's it going? All right. So when we're talking about varieties of language, right? If we're going to call something descriptively ungrammatical, right? We're saying basically that it's not part of the regular speech of any native speakers. We're not saying that native speakers never produce things, because, native speakers can produce errors, right? The difference between an error and a dialect feature is a dialect feature is systematic, right? When whereas an error is a sort of one-off performance issue, right? That's different from saying that something is prescriptively ungrammatical. All right. Well, Bins, you're going to have to use it. Hey, Tenno. Doesn't matter if you're an hour late. Ament only in chat. So when we say that something is prescriptively grammatical, we mean that it's disapproved of by some kind of language authorities, right? Both of these terms, though, have to be are complicated, right? This presents it in a way that is simpler than it will turn out to be in practice, but it's a useful abstraction to think about, right? Like native speakers, well, we already said not all native speakers do things the same way, right? There are some things that pretty much no native speaker will do. They're just sort of universally not allowed in any variety of English, but it can be hard unless you have a really comprehensive knowledge of all the different dialects to know what those are, right? Normally, we'll use that just to say, okay, oh, hey, Kim, how's it going? Yeah, I'm not judging you, Kim. I'm just explaining how we're not judging you. You missed all the, my stuff about one of my anti-goals in this is to make people feel inferior or uncomfortable about their language, right? Correct grammar is an arbitrary fiction. It's a convenient fiction that we accept and that, it has its purposes. There are places for it. I'm not going to pretend you won't be judged in certain circles for using, non-standard language. On the other hand, in other circles, you'll be judged for using standard language. So, use it at your risk, right? So when we say something is prescriptively ungrammatical, right, we're basically saying the books disapprove of it. But here, too, you have to be careful because the books are not unanimous about what they accept or what they disapprove of. One of the things about the English-speaking countries is that we have no central authority to decide what is correct standard English, right? Quite a few countries have such a body, right? The French have the Académie Française, which is often mocked by other French people, right? The Académie has been in existence since, I think, the 16th century, maybe the early 17th century, and they have utterly failed to halt any aspect of language change in French, despite their vociferous objections to, like all the English borrowings, like le parking and things like that, le weekend. French has borrowed lots of English terms. The Académie hates them, but ordinary French people use them all the time, right? We don't have any body like that. Le weekend rules, yes, Vince. We don't have any body like that in any English-speaking country. So who are the authorities to decide what is correct or not? It's basically a very loose agglomeration of English teachers, editors, authors of style guides. There's no particular, other than being a teacher, there's no particular credentialing process for any of these things, right? Anyone can write a book on grammar and set him or herself up as an expert, right? And all too often, that's exactly what has happened. Some of these books are really terrible, right? Your sister's at Lissad. Exactly. Sometimes things that get complained about in books turn out to be simply the pet peeve of an author, right? See, even Kai gets upset at these books. Right? Exactly. Grammar. Yes, absolutely. In fact, one of the most widely assigned usage guides out there is Strunk and White's Elements of Style. It is an absolutely wretched book. If you've never been exposed to it, don't get it. Even if somebody is fawning over it and recommending it to you, it is a bad book. There are worse, but that for really popular best-selling books, that's a bad book.